A letter? Your Honor, what is this? Some desperate last-ditch effort? The judge's gaze, sharp as a knife, swept across the room before landing on Richard. His voice, firm and cutting, silenced all whispers. Mr. Sterling, this letter was delivered to the court with explicit instructions to be read only if a hearing for a default judgment were to proceed. And we find ourselves in that exact scenario. I suggest you listen very carefully. With that, he decisively broke the wax seal. And then the first words were read, echoing clear, like an irrevocable verdict. To the honorable court, and to you, Richard Sterling, the man who has no idea he is about to become a father. The entire room fell silent. What secrets did that letter hold that could bring an entire empire to its knees? Would Richard lose everything in an instant? Or was this his only chance to find himself again? Whatever time it is in your country, we know you won't want to look away. Hit that subscribe button to follow the dramatic fallout with us right after this. And before we continue, have you ever witnessed a single mistake that cost someone everything? Share your story in the comments below. The city sprawled beneath the penthouse like a glittering chessboard, its lights pulsing with the rhythm of ambition. Richard Sterling leaned back in a sleek leather chair, a glass of aged bourbon in hand, its amber glow catching the chandelier's refracted light. Across from him, Amberlyn Vance perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, her fingers dancing across her phone, crafting hashtags for a future that hadn't yet arrived. The air was thick with the scent of victory, his victory. Tomorrow the courtroom would seal it, a clean break from Elena, the woman who'd tethered him to a past he'd outgrown, and a new chapter with Amberlyn, who understood the world he'd built. "This is it, Amber," Richard said, his voice smooth as the bourbon. "After tomorrow, we're free to redefine the Sterling brand. No more baggage, just the future." He gestured toward the cityscape beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, as if the skyline itself bowed to his will. Amberlyn looked up, her eyes bright with calculated admiration. "You're a visionary, Richard. The world needs to see you without distractions." Her words were honeyed, but they carried a practiced edge, honed from years of spinning brands into gold. She tapped her phone, pulling up a mock-up of a campaign. Picture this: Richard Sterling, the man who built Nexus. We'll flood the feeds, X, Instagram, everywhere. You're not just a CEO, you're a legend. Richard's lips curled into a smile, the kind that had closed billion-dollar deals. Amberlyn got it. She saw the empire he'd carved from nothing, the way he'd taken Elena's code, brilliant, sure, but lifeless without him, and turned it into Nexus Innovations, a name that echoed in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Singapore. Elena had been there in the beginning, scribbling algorithms in their cramped apartment, but she hadn't evolved. She was still that quiet coder, content with her laptops and her ideals, while he soared into a world of private jets and power lunches. She didn't belong in his orbit anymore. "She lacked ambition," Richard said, swirling his drink. "Elena built the foundation, fine, but I made it a dynasty. Without me, Nexus would have been just another startup rotting in a garage." He leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "I sold the dream, Amber. I made the world want it." Amberlyn nodded, her fingers pausing on her phone. "Exactly. She's holding you back, Richard. You're meant for bigger things, global campaigns, TED Talks, maybe even politics. You can't do that with her dragging you down." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tomorrow's just a formality, right? You've got this in the bag." Richard's chest swelled with certainty. His lawyer, Marcus Thorne, had assured him the divorce would be swift. Elena hadn't even hired counsel, a sign of her predictable passivity. He'd offered her a generous settlement, more than she deserved, he thought. The marital home, a lump sum, lifelong alimony. It was magnanimous, a gesture befitting a king. After all, he was the architect of their fortune, the one who'd turned her lines of code into a story the world couldn't resist. She'd take the deal, retreat to her quiet life, and he'd move on with Amberlin, who thrived in the spotlight he'd created. The penthouse hummed with the low buzz of possibility. Amberlin scrolled through her phone, showing Richard a draft post for X, a photo of him at a gala, captioned, "Building the Future, One Connection at a Time. Sterling Legacy." She grinned. "This'll go viral the second the papers are signed." Richard sipped his bourbon, savoring the burn. "Make it bolder," he said. Something like, "The man who redefined connection. Keep it sharp. I want the world to know who's driving this ship." Amberlin's fingers flew across her screen, editing with a fervor that matched his own. This was why he'd chosen her. She didn't just follow his vision, she amplified it, polished it, and made it shine. He stood crossing to the window, his reflection merging with the city below. He saw himself as he wanted to be seen, untouchable, a titan who'd conquered markets and minds. Elena had been his partner once, yes, but that was a lifetime ago, in a world of cheap coffee and late-night coding sessions. Back then they'd dreamed together, sketching Nexus's first prototype on napkins over takeout. But dreams evolve, and hers hadn't. She clung to quaint notions of impact and community, while he chased power, the kind that reshaped industries. He'd outgrown her, plain and simple. "Tomorrow," he said, more to himself than Amberlin, "we close this chapter." He turned, his eyes glinting with resolve. "Marcus says it's a slam dunk. Elena didn't even respond to the petition. She's probably at home, tinkering with some outdated algorithm, too proud to fight." Amberlin set her phone down, rising to join him at the window. "She doesn't get it, does she? This world, your world, it's not for her. It's for people like us who know how to play the game." She rested a hand on his arm, her touch light but deliberate. "You're doing the right thing, Richard. For you, for Nexus, for the legacy." The word legacy hung in the air, heavy with promise. Richard imagined the headlines, the profiles in Forbes and Wired, all celebrating him as the sole genius behind Nexus. Elena's contributions would fade into obscurity, a footnote at best. He felt a fleeting pang, something like guilt, but not quite. It was pity, perhaps, for the woman who'd once believed in him but couldn't keep up. He pushed it aside. Pity was for the weak. His phone buzzed on the glass table, snapping him back to the moment. A text from Marcus. "All set for tomorrow. Court at 9 a.m. Default judgment motion ready. She didn't contest. Easy win." Richard's smile widened. He showed the screen to Amberlin, who clapped her hands, her laughter bright and sharp. "See?" she said. "I told you. A formality. By this time tomorrow, you'll be free." She raised her glass of wine, clinking it against his bourbon. "To the sterling legacy." "To the future," Richard corrected, draining his glass. The bourbon warmed his throat, fueling his certainty. He pictured the courtroom, the judge's gavel falling, the papers signed. Elena would fade away, and he'd step into the next phase of his empire, untethered, unstoppable. He walked to his desk, pulling out a leather-bound planner. Tomorrow's schedule was meticulous. Court at 9, lunch with investors at noon, a press release by evening to announce his new chapter. Amberlin would handle the social media blitz, ensuring every post cemented his image as the visionary who'd built Nexus from nothing. He closed the planner with a snap, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet penthouse. As Amberlin chattered about influencers they could tap for the campaign, Richard's gaze drifted back to the city. For a moment, unbidden, an image flickered in his mind. Elena, sitting cross-legged on their old apartment floor, her fingers flying over a keyboard, her quiet voice suggesting a name. Nexus. He shook his head, banishing the memory. That was the past. Tomorrow he'd claim the future. He turned to Amberlin, his voice firm. "Call Marcus. Tell him to meet me at the courthouse at 8:30. I want this done clean, fast, and final." Amberlynn nodded, already dialing, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the game. Richard Sterling, the king in his castle, stood ready to conquer, but somewhere in a quiet corner of the city, a letter was being sealed, its words poised to unravel everything he thought he'd won. The sharp click of Richard Sterling's polished shoes echoed off the marble floor as he strode into family courtroom 3B, the weight of his certainty propelling each step. Amberlynn trailed just behind, her heels tapping a staccato rhythm, her confident smile a mirror of his own. The room smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, a stark contrast to the polished boardrooms Richard ruled. He smoothed the lapel of his tailored suit, a silent defiance against the mundane surroundings. This was a formality, nothing more, a final signature to sever the past and launch his future. He glanced at Amberlynn, who gave a subtle nod, her eyes gleaming with the promise of a victory post already drafted on her phone. The courtroom was sparsely filled, a few reporters in the back scribbling lazily, and a clerk organizing papers at the bench. Richard took his seat beside Marcus Thorne, his lawyer, whose crisp suit and sharper demeanor radiated control. Marcus leaned in, his voice low. "It's airtight, Richard. Elena didn't file a response. Default judgment's ours. You'll be out of here by 10. Richard's lips twitched into a half-smile. Elena's silence was so predictable, resigned, passive, like the woman who'd faded into the background of his life. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, cutting through the hum of anticipation. Judge David Thompson entered, his black robe flowing like a shadow. He settled into his high-backed chair, his face an unreadable mask, eyes scanning the room with the weight of someone who'd seen every shade of human failure. Richard met his gaze briefly, expecting a flicker of recognition for the Sterling name. There was none. A faint irritation stirred in him, but he brushed it aside. This judge, like everyone else, would bend to the inevitability of his win. "We are here to hear the petition for the dissolution of the marriage between Richard Sterling, petitioner, and Elena Sterling, respondent," Judge Thompson began, his voice dry and precise, like the ticking of a clock. "Mr. Thorne, you may proceed." Marcus stood, exuding the smooth confidence of a man who'd never lost a case like this. "Your Honor, we seek a default judgment in favor of my client, Mr. Richard Sterling. The respondent, Mrs. Elena Sterling, has failed to file a response within the allotted time. Mr. Sterling has offered a settlement that is, by any measure, exceptionally generous. The marital home, a substantial lump sum, and lifelong alimony. This reflects his desire for an amicable resolution to what has been a mutually acknowledged end to their partnership." Marcus paused, letting the words settle, his tone implying the matter was already decided. "Given the respondent's lack of contest, we request that the court approve the settlement and grant the dissolution." Richard leaned back, his fingers steepled, savoring the moment. Marcus's words were a perfectly crafted script, each syllable reinforcing the narrative Richard had built. He was the magnanimous victor, offering charity to a woman who'd failed to keep pace with his ambition. He imagined Elena at home, lost in her world of code and quiet ideals, too proud or too weak to fight. The reporters scribbled faster now, sensing the routine end to a high-profile divorce. Amberlynn shifted beside him, her hand brushing his arm, a silent celebration of their shared triumph. Judge Thompson remained silent, his gaze fixed on the file before him. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second amplifying the tension in the room. Richard's eyes narrowed. Why the delay? This should be over already. Marcus cleared his throat, a subtle prompt, but the judge didn't move. Instead, he reached for a cream-colored envelope on his desk. its wax seal catching the fluorescent light. The room seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Thompson said finally, his voice low and deliberate, slicing through the silence like a blade. "You state the respondent has not replied. That is not entirely accurate." He held up the envelope, its weight seeming to shift the air itself. "The court has received a letter from Mrs. Elena Sterling, delivered by courier this morning, with explicit instructions to be read in open court should a hearing for default judgment proceed." Richard's jaw tightened, his pulse quickening. A letter? What was this? Some last-ditch emotional plea? He glanced at Marcus, whose polished facade faltered for a split second, a crack in his usual armor. Amberlynn's hand froze on her phone, her smile fading into a frown of confusion. The reporters leaned forward, pens poised, sensing a shift in the story. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor," Marcus interjected, recovering his composure. "Any correspondence should have been filed through proper legal channels. We've received no communication from the respondent or her counsel." "Ordinarily, I would agree," Judge Thompson replied, his eyes locking onto Richard with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "However, given the unique contents of this letter and Mrs. Sterling's cited reasons for her absence, I have decided to allow it." He paused, letting the words hang heavy. "We find ourselves precisely in the scenario she anticipated, a hearing for default judgment." Richard's heart began to hammer, a primal instinct warning him of danger. This wasn't the Elena he knew, the quiet coder who'd let him take the spotlight. This was something else, something calculated. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening, as Amberlynn shifted uncomfortably beside him, her earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of unease. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his tone now stripped of judicial neutrality, carrying the weight of a man about to unveil a truth that could not be undone. "I suggest you listen very carefully." He broke the wax seal with a deliberate crack, unfolded the letter, and began to read. The words that followed were not a plea, not a rant, but a carefully aimed arrow, poised to pierce the heart of Richard's carefully constructed empire. As the judge's voice filled the silent courtroom, Richard felt the first tremor of a world he thought he'd mastered beginning to crumble beneath him. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Thompson's fingers unfolded the cream-colored pages, the faint rustle of paper slicing through the silence like a verdict waiting to land. Richard Sterling sat rigid, his hands gripping the table's edge, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears. The wax seal's broken edges lay discarded on the judge's bench, a small but ominous relic of Elena's unseen hand. Amberlynn beside him clutched her phone, her earlier poise replaced by a nervous fidgeting, her eyes darting between Richard and the judge. Marcus Thorne's polished confidence wavered. His pen froze in mid-note. The air was thick, charged with the weight of words yet unspoken, and Richard felt the first crack in the foundation of his certainty. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, his voice steady but laced with a gravity that made the room feel smaller. "To the Honorable Court and Mr. Richard Sterling," he began, each word deliberate, as if chiseling stone. "I write not from weakness, but from a place of clarity. I cannot stand in this courtroom, not because I fear confrontation, but because I refuse to reduce what we built to a spectacle of greed." Richard's breath caught. This wasn't the Elena he'd dismissed as passive, the coder lost in her algorithms. Her words, read in the judge's unflinching tone, carried a quiet power, sharp and precise. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under him, as the judge continued. "You sit there, Richard, believing this is a simple transaction, a division of assets, a closing of accounts. But what we created was never just a company. Nexus Innovations was born from a shared dream, one we forged in late nights and empty coffee cups when every line of code I wrote was matched by your promises to the world. I built the machine. You gave it a voice, but somewhere along the way, you forgot the we. A murmur rippled through the reporters in the back, their pens scratching furiously. Richard's jaw tightened, a flush of heat creeping up his neck. This was too personal, too raw, aired out in a courtroom like dirty laundry. He glanced at Marcus, expecting an objection, but his lawyer's eyes were fixed on the judge, his face pale. Amberlynn's hand twitched, her phone screen dimming as she forgot to scroll. The judge's voice pressed on, relentless. 2 months ago, I tried to tell you something, Richard. You were pacing our living room, shouting into your phone about a deal worth millions. I stood there holding news that would change everything, but you waved me away, said it could wait. It couldn't. That night I learned I was carrying our child, your son. The word son landed like a stone in still water, sending shockwaves through the room. Richard's mind went blank, the courtroom blurring at the edges. A son? His son? He hadn't known. How could he not have known? Amberlynn let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The reporters erupted into whispers, their notes now frantic. Marcus's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the table. Judge Thompson paused, his eyes locking onto Richard with an intensity that pinned him in place. But this letter is not about our child alone, he continued, turning the page. It's about the truth you've tried to erase. You claim Nexus as your empire, Richard, but I hold the blueprints. The original documents, the ones we drafted together in that cramped apartment, bear my handwriting, my ideas. The concept of Nexus Promise, the vision of technology serving communities, not just profits, was mine. You promised to honor it, but you buried it under your deals and your spotlight. Richard's heart pounded, each beat a hammer against his ribs. He remembered those documents, scribbled notes, flowcharts, Elena's meticulous handwriting, outlining the core of Nexus. He dismissed them as relics, irrelevant to the empire he'd built. But now, her words were pulling them into the light, exposing the lie he'd told himself, that he was the sole architect. The judge's voice grew heavier, each syllable a nail in Richard's carefully crafted narrative. You seek to divide what you call a marriage, but there is no marriage to dissolve. We agreed, in an email you sent years ago, to delay formal vows until Nexus stood on its own. That email, preserved in my records, proves no legal union exists. Your claim to half of Nexus under common law marriage is baseless. A collective gasp swept the room. Marcus's face drained of color, his hands fumbling for his briefcase as if searching for a lifeline. Richard felt the floor tilt beneath him, his empire crumbling under the weight of a single email. He'd forgotten it. Those early days when they'd chosen ambition over ceremony, a decision he'd made so casually, now wielded like a blade. I do not write to destroy you, the judge read on, Elena's words softening, but no less piercing. I write to protect our son's legacy and the truth of what we built. I propose a choice, Richard. Walk away with nothing, or join me in reviving Nexus Promise, the vision we once shared, not for profit, but for purpose. The court holds copies of my documents, and my counsel, Amelia Vance, will ensure they are seen if you choose to fight. The judge lowered the letter, his gaze cutting through Richard like glass. This court stands adjourned for 1 week, he declared, his gavel cracking down with a sound that echoed like thunder. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you reconsider your position. This is no longer a simple divorce. The room erupted into chaos, reporters shouting into phones, Marcus whispering urgently to Richard, Amberlynn staring at him with wide, panicked eyes. Richard sat frozen, Elena's words ringing in his ears. Our son, my documents, Nexus Promise. The narrative he'd sold to the world, Richard Sterling, the lone genius, was unraveling, thread by thread. He looked at Amberlynn, expecting her support, But she was already gathering her purse, her face a mask of disbelief. "Richard," she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "You said this was clean. You said you had it handled." Before he could respond, she stood, her heels clicking as she hurried toward the exit, leaving him alone with the weight of a truth he hadn't seen coming. The gavel's echo lingered in Richard Sterling's ears like a death knell as Judge Thompson swept out of the courtroom, his robe a dark tide receding. The room buzzed with chaos, reporters shouting into phones, their voices a frenetic hum, the air thick with the scent of ink and betrayal. Richard sat frozen, his hands still gripping the table, the world he'd built fracturing beneath Elena's words. "Our son, no marriage, Nexus promise." Each phrase from her letter was a precision strike, dismantling the empire he'd claimed as his own. He stared at the empty bench, the judge's vacant chair a silent accusation. Marcus Thorne's voice cut through the haze, urgent and strained. "Richard, we're in deep trouble." He shoved papers into his briefcase, his usual polish replaced by a sheen of sweat on his brow. "That email? She's got us dead to rights, no marriage, no common law claim. And those documents? If she can prove she co-created Nexus, we're not just talking divorce. We're talking lawsuits, intellectual property disputes, a public relations nightmare." Richard barely registered the words. His mind was a storm, replaying Elena's letter. "I built the machine. You gave it a voice." He'd dismissed her as a relic, a coder lost in her algorithms. But she'd outmaneuvered him with a single sheet of paper. He felt Amberlynn's presence beside him, her silence louder than the reporter's chatter. He turned, expecting her support, her calculated charm to pull him back from the edge. Instead, Amberlynn stood, her purse clutched tightly, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You said this was clean, Richard," she hissed, her voice low but cutting, like a blade slipped between ribs. "You told me it was over, that you had it handled. A son? No marriage? You didn't even know?" Her words dripped with accusation, each one a step toward the exit. "You said you were an empire, but you're nothing without that piece of paper. Don't call me." "Amber, wait." Richard reached for her, his voice cracking, but she jerked away, her heels clicking furiously on the marble floor. The sound faded into the corridor, leaving a void that swallowed the last shred of his confidence. She was gone, the future he'd envisioned with her dissolving like smoke. The reporters noticed, their whispers sharpening into speculation, pens scratching out the first drafts of a scandal. Marcus grabbed his arm, pulling him back to the moment. "Richard, focus. We need to regroup. Amelia Vance, Elena's lawyer, she's a shark. If those documents are real, we're looking at a fight we can't win. Not in court, not in the press." He lowered his voice, glancing at the reporters. "We need to talk strategy now before this leaks." Richard shook his head, his thoughts a tangled mess. "She's bluffing," he said, more to convince himself than Marcus. "Those documents, they're just old notes, scribbles. They don't mean anything." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. He remembered Elena's meticulous handwriting, the flowchart she'd drawn, the quiet moment when she'd named Nexus Promise. He'd laughed it off then, a naive dream of tech for good. Now it was a weapon aimed at his legacy. "They mean everything to a jury," Marcus snapped, his frustration boiling over. "A wronged woman with proof she built your company, pregnant with your child, against a billionaire who tried to erase her. You do the math, Richard." He stuffed the last of his papers into his briefcase and stood. "I'll call you tonight. Get your head together. We're not done yet, but we're on thin ice." Marcus strode out, leaving Richard alone in the emptying courtroom. The reporters lingered, their eyes predatory, sensing a story that would dominate headlines. Richard stood slowly, his legs unsteady, as if the ground itself had betrayed him. He walked to the window, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass, a kingdom he thought he'd owned. Now, it felt like a mirage, slipping through his fingers. He replayed the letter in his mind, each word a fresh wound. Our son. He hadn't known, hadn't even suspected. That night, 2 months ago, when Elena had tried to talk to him, he'd been consumed by a deal, barking into his phone, dismissing her with a wave. He'd seen her hesitate, her hand resting briefly on her stomach, but he hadn't cared enough to ask. Now, that moment was a noose tightening around his neck. The courtroom doors swung open, and a woman in a sharp gray pantsuit entered, her leather briefcase swinging with purpose. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice cool and precise, "I'm Amelia Vance, counsel for Elena Sterling." She handed Marcus's empty chair a thick envelope. "This is a revised proposal. I suggest you review it carefully. We've also filed a motion to dismiss your default judgment request. My client is prepared to proceed. We'll see you in a week." She turned, her heels clicking with the same finality as Amberlin's, and left without another word. Richard stared at the envelope, its weight heavier than any contract he'd ever signed. Amelia Vance's reputation preceded her, a litigator who dismantled corporate giants without raising her voice. Elena wasn't just fighting back, she was rewriting the rules. He sank back into his chair, the courtroom now silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The reporters had gone, chasing their deadlines, leaving him with the wreckage of his plans. He thought of Amberlin's parting words, her anger a mirror of his own failure. He thought of Elena, not the quiet coder he'd underestimated, but the strategist who'd just turned his world upside down. For the first time in years, Richard Sterling felt small, exposed, and utterly alone. He clutched the envelope, its edges sharp against his palms. Whatever it contained, he knew it held the blueprint for his unraveling. The king had fallen and the castle he'd built was crumbling. The city lights pulsed beyond the penthouse windows, their relentless glow mocking Richard Sterling's unraveling. A week had passed since the courtroom's collapse, and the once invincible king sat alone in his glass castle, the silence heavier than the chaos he'd left behind. The cream-colored envelope from Amelia Vance lay unopened on the glass table, its edges pristine, a silent judge in the dim light. Richard's bourbon sat untouched, the ice long melted, pooling like his thoughts, murky, stagnant, and cold. The world he'd built, the empire he'd claimed, felt like a stranger's dream now, shattered by Elena's letter and the truth it carried. He slouched in the leather chair, the same one where he'd toasted his future with Amberlin just days ago. Her absence was a wound, not of love, but of pride. She hadn't called, hadn't texted. Her social media was silent on the Sterling brand she'd once championed. The X posts were merciless. Headlines screaming, "Nexus founder's divorce debacle," and "Silent genius Elena Sterling stakes her claim." Reporters painted her as the unsung architect of Nexus Innovations, while Richard's name was reduced to a cautionary tale of hubris. He'd tried calling his investors, his boardroom allies, but their responses were curt, distant, or non-existent. The kingdom he'd ruled was turning its back. Richard's gaze drifted to his phone, its screen dark except for a single notification, a news alert praising Elena as the quiet titan who'd outsmarted her estranged partner. The words stung, not because they were false, but because they were true. He dismissed her as a relic, a coder lost in her ideals, but she'd been the foundation all along. He stood, pacing the penthouse, his footsteps muffled by the plush rug. The space felt cavernous now, its sleek furniture and modern art a hollow reflection of a life he'd thought was his. He stopped at a bookshelf, his fingers brushing a forgotten frame, tucked behind a stack of business journals. He pulled it out, the glass cool against his palm. It was a photo from their college days. He and Elena standing side by side, her hand pointing to a whiteboard scrawled with equations, his arm slung casually around her shoulders. They were smiling, unguarded, their dreams still raw and shared. Nexus had been born there, in that cluttered apartment, fueled by her code and his charisma. He'd forgotten how her quiet focus had anchored him, how her vision had given his words weight. Now that memory felt like a betrayal of the man he'd become. The photo slipped from his hand, clattering onto the shelf. Richard sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. Elena's letter replayed in his mind, not the judge's voice, but hers, calm and unyielding. Our son, Nexus promise, the truth. He hadn't known about the child, hadn't cared to listen when she'd tried to tell him. That night, 2 months ago, she'd stood in their living room, her voice soft but urgent, and he'd waved her off, consumed by a deal that now seemed trivial. The image of her hand on her stomach haunted him, a moment he'd ignored but could no longer escape. His phone buzzed again, another news alert, but he ignored it. The world was rewriting his story, and he had no script to follow. He thought of Amelia Vance's envelope, its contents a mystery he wasn't ready to face. Was it a demand for everything? Nexus, his wealth, his name? Or was it, as Elena's letter had suggested, an invitation to something else? Nexus promise, the quixotic dream of technology for good, had been her idea, one he'd buried under contracts and stock options. Could she really mean for him to join her? Or was it a trap to humiliate him further? Richard stood and crossed to the desk, his laptop glowing faintly in the dark. He opened it, the screen casting shadows across his face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, itching to fire off an email to Elena, to lash out, to blame her for dismantling his world. He typed a single line, "You think you've won, don't you?" But the words stared back, petty and hollow. He deleted them, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat in the empty document. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the city's hum a distant pulse through the windows. For the first time in years, Richard felt the weight of his choices, not the deals he'd closed or the headlines he'd chased, but the moments he'd overlooked. Elena's quiet strength, her belief in their shared dream, had been the spine of Nexus, and he'd treated it like scaffolding to be discarded. Now, with Amberlin gone, his allies silent and the courtroom looming, he was alone with the truth he'd tried to erase. The envelope on the table seemed to pulse with possibility, a challenge or a lifeline. He couldn't tell which. He reached for it, then stopped, his hand trembling. Whatever Elena had planned, whatever Amelia Vance was preparing, it would demand more than his charm or his bravado. For the first time, Richard Sterling wasn't sure he could talk his way out. The penthouse, once his throne room, was now a cage, its echoes whispering of a reckoning he could no longer avoid. The penthouse was a tomb of shadows, the city's glow beyond the windows reduced to a faint pulse against the night. Richard Sterling sat hunched over his laptop, the screen's cold light carving deep lines across his face. The cream-colored envelope from Amelia Vance still lay unopened on the glass table, its presence a silent challenge that had haunted him for a week. The bourbon bottle was empty now, its contents replaced by a dull ache in his temples. The silence of the penthouse pressed against him, broken only by the soft hum of the laptop and the relentless ticking of a wall clock, counting down to a future he could no longer control. Richard's fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking in an empty email draft. He'd tried to write to Elena a dozen times since the courtroom, each attempt a snarl of anger and blame. "You planned this, didn't you? You waited to ruin me." But the words always crumbled under their own weight, childish and hollow. He'd deleted them all, each keystroke a surrender to the truth he'd been dodging. Elena, hadn't ruined him. He'd done that himself. Her letter, her unborn son, her documents, they were mirrors reflecting a man who'd traded substance for shine. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes, the photo from their college days still propped against the bookshelf where he'd left it. Elena's handwriting on that whiteboard, the spark of Nexus in its infancy, haunted him. He'd been the voice, yes, but she'd been the mind, the one who'd turned their dreams into reality. He'd buried that truth under deals and headlines, convinced himself he was the empire. Now, with Amberlynn gone, his allies silent, and the press circling like vultures, he saw the cost of his delusion. The laptop screen dimmed, snapping him back. He opened a new email, addressing it to Marcus Thorne. His fingers moved slowly at first, then with a quiet resolve. "Marcus," he typed, "withdraw the petition for default judgment. Inform Ms. Vance that I accept Elena's proposal to join Nexus Promise. No further litigation." He paused, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. The words were simple, but they felt like a confession, an admission that he'd been wrong, not just about the law, but about everything. He hit send, the soft chime of the email cutting through the silence like a door swinging shut. Richard exhaled. A weight lifted from his chest, but it left behind a raw uncertainty. Joining Nexus Promise meant stepping into Elena's world, a place of purpose over profit, a vision he'd mocked as naive. Could he do it? Could he rebuild from the ashes of his ego? The thought terrified him, but for the first time in weeks it also sparked something like hope, a faint ember in the wreckage of his pride. His phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. Received. I'll notify Vance's team. Meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m. to discuss terms. This is the right call, Richard. The words were meant to reassure, but they only deepened the churn in his gut. He'd spent years orchestrating boardrooms, charming investors, spinning stories that made him untouchable. Now he was walking into a negotiation where he had no leverage, no script, only the truth that Elena had forced him to face. He stood crossing to the window, the city sprawling below like a map of his past victories. But they felt hollow now, each skyscraper a monument to a man who no longer existed. He thought of Elena, not the quiet coder he'd dismissed, but the woman who'd outmaneuvered him with a single letter. She hadn't fought for money or revenge, she'd fought for their son, for the dream they'd once shared. That realization stung more than Amberlynn's betrayal, more than the headlines tearing him apart. Richard's gaze fell to the envelope again. He picked it up, its weight heavier than its size suggested. He slid a finger under the flap, hesitating, then set it back down. Whatever terms Amelia Vance had drafted, he'd face them tomorrow. For now, the act of sending that email felt like enough. A first step, not toward victory, but toward something he couldn't yet name. He returned to the laptop, opening a new tab. The Nexus Promise website loaded, a relic from their early days, its mission statement untouched by the corporate sheen he'd imposed on the company. Technology for connection, not conquest. Elena's words, her vision. He scrolled through, his eyes lingering on a photo from a community event. Elena speaking to a group of students, her presence steady, unassuming. He hadn't noticed her strength back then, hadn't wanted to. Now, it was all he could see. The clock struck midnight, its chime a soft echo in the empty penthouse. Richard closed the laptop, the screen going dark. He didn't know what tomorrow's meeting would bring. Amelia Vance's demands, Elena's expectations, or the shape of a future without his crown. But for the first time, he wasn't running from it. The email was sent, the petition withdrawn. He'd chosen Elena's path, not because he had to, but because it was the only one left that felt true. He leaned back in the chair, the city's pulse faint beyond the glass. The penthouse was no longer a castle, but it wasn't a cage anymore either. It was a crossroads. and Richard Sterling, stripped of his illusions, was ready to take his first step. The morning light filtered through the modest windows of the Nexus Promise office, a small, unassuming space tucked in a quiet corner of the city. Richard Sterling stood at the edge of the room, his tailored suit replaced by a simple button-down and slacks, the fabric feeling foreign without the weight of his usual armor. 6 months had passed since he'd sent the email withdrawing his petition, a decision that had dismantled the life he'd known. The penthouse was gone, sold to cover legal fees and settle the fallout with Nexus's board. This office, with its second-hand desks and humming fluorescent lights, was his new reality, a far cry from the glass towers he'd once commanded. The room buzzed with quiet energy, a handful of young women, students from a local tech program, huddled around a whiteboard, sketching ideas for a community app. Richard watched them, his hands clasped behind his back, no longer the king, issuing decrees but a listener, learning their language. Their voices were bright, unpolished, filled with a passion that reminded him of nights spent with Elena, dreaming up Nexus over takeout and cheap coffee. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that raw, unfiltered purpose until now. "Mr. Sterling," one of the students, Maya, said, her marker pausing mid-stroke, "what if we prioritize accessibility, like voice navigation for visually impaired users?" Her eyes were eager, searching for his approval, but not the kind he was used to, flattery for his name or wealth. She wanted his thoughts, not his title. Richard hesitated, the instinct to dominate the conversation rising, then fading. "That's a solid angle," he said, stepping closer to the whiteboard. "Have you considered integrating haptic feedback? It could make the app more intuitive for users with motor challenges." Maya's face lit up, and the group dove back into discussion, their ideas flowing faster now. Richard felt a strange warmth, not triumph, but something quieter, connection. He'd taken Elena's offer to join Nexus Promise, not out of nobility but necessity. Amelia Vance's revised proposal had been uncompromising. Richard could retain a minority stake in Nexus Innovations, but only if he committed to leading the Quitesy, turning Elena's vision of technology for good into reality. Refusal meant facing her documents in court, a battle he'd lose spectacularly. So he'd signed, trading his CEO throne for a desk in this modest office, his role reduced to collaborator, not commander. The transition hadn't been easy. The first weeks were a blur of skepticism. From the board, the press, even himself. Could he do this? Lead without ego? Build without headlines? Every day was a test, a chance to prove he was more than the man who'd tried to erase Elena. He'd started small, meeting with community leaders, listening to their needs, learning to ask questions instead of giving answers. It was humbling, and he was still clumsy at it, but the students' energy, their unguarded optimism, was starting to feel like a lifeline. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from the moment. He slipped it out, expecting another email from Marcus, who'd become a reluctant ally in navigating the legal aftermath. Instead, it was a message from Elena, a single image, no text, a 3D ultrasound scan, the delicate outline of a child, his son, curled in a world not yet his. Richard's breath caught, his thumb tracing the screen. The image was a bridge, fragile but real, a silent acknowledgement that he was still part of something larger than himself. He tucked the phone away, his chest tight with a mix of gratitude and guilt. Elena hadn't spoken to him directly since the courtroom, communicating only through Amelia or brief formal emails about Nexus Promise. He didn't expect forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. But this image, this gesture was more than he deserved. It was a door cracked open, a chance to earn a place in a future he'd almost destroyed. "Mr. Sterling?" Maya's voice broke through again, tentative but curious. "You worked on the original Nexus, right? What was it like, building something from nothing?" The other students turned, their eyes bright with interest, not judgment. Richard paused, the question catching him off guard. He could have spun a story, the polished tale of a visionary CEO. Instead, he surprised himself. "It was hard," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "Late nights, endless failures, a lot of doubt. But it was also the best thing I've ever done because I wasn't alone. I had—" He stopped, the name Elena heavy on his tongue, then continued. "I had a partner who believed in it more than I did sometimes. She made it real." The students nodded, their faces open, unguarded. Richard felt a shift, small but seismic. He wasn't selling a story anymore. He was telling one, raw and true. The whiteboard hummed with new ideas, the room alive with possibility. For the first time in months, Richard didn't feel like a king or a failure, just a man trying to build something worth keeping. He glanced at his phone again, the ultrasound image lingering in his mind. The meeting wrapped up, the students packing their notebooks, their laughter echoing as they left. Richard stayed behind, the office quiet now, the whiteboard a map of dreams not unlike the ones he'd shared with Elena years ago. He didn't know what lay ahead, whether Elena would ever stand beside him again, or what his son's world would look like. But for the first time, he wasn't running from the unknown. He was stepping toward it, one careful choice at a time. The morning sun cut through the autumn chill, casting golden streaks across the construction site where the Nexus Promise Training Center stood half-built, its steel frame rising like a promise against the city skyline. Richard Sterling lingered at the edge of the crowd, his breath visible in the crisp air, his hands tucked into the pockets of a simple jacket. The grandeur of his old life, penthouse views, tailored suits, was a distant memory, replaced by the quiet purpose of this moment. A year had passed since he'd stepped into the modest Nexus Promise office, and today marked the Quiddy's first major milestone, a center dedicated to training women of color in technology, Elena's vision brought to life. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, community leaders, students, local reporters, their voices mingling with the clatter of construction equipment. Richard stood apart, not seeking the spotlight, content to watch as the ceremony unfolded. A small stage held a podium where Maya, the student from his first meeting at the Quiddy, spoke passionately about the center's mission. Her words echoed Elena's, filled with a belief in technology as a bridge, not a barrier. Richard listened, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He'd helped shape this moment, not by leading, but by supporting, reviewing proposals, securing grants, amplifying voices like Maya's. It was work that demanded patience, not bravado, and he was still learning its rhythm. His gaze drifted to the crowd's edge where Elena stood cradling their son, Christopher, in her arms. The boy, barely 6 months old, nestled against her, his tiny hand clutching her scarf. Richard hadn't seen her in person since the courtroom, their communication limited to emails and Amelia Vance's crisp updates. Yet here she was, her presence steady, commanding, without effort. She hadn't invited him to this ceremony, but she hadn't excluded him either. The ultrasound image she'd sent months ago had been their only direct connection, a silent thread that had pulled him through the long nights of rebuilding himself. Maya's speech ended, and the crowd applauded, the sound warm and full. A ribbon stretched across the site's entrance, ready for the ceremonial cut. Elena stepped forward, passing Christopher to a colleague before taking the podium. Her voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the same quiet strength as her letter. "This center," she said, "is not about technology alone. It's about people, about giving them tools to build, to connect, to dream. Nexus Promise was always meant to be this, a legacy of impact, not profit." The crowd nodded, some wiping tears, others clapping softly. Richard felt a pang, not of jealousy but of recognition. This was Elena's stage, her vision, and he was no longer the one selling it. He was here to witness, to contribute, to learn. The shift still unsettled him, but it also felt right, like a piece of code finally compiling without errors. As the ribbon cutting began, Elena glanced his way, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. There was no warmth there, not yet, but no anger either, just a quiet acknowledgement. She turned back to the ribbon, scissors flashing in the sunlight, and the crowd cheered as it fell. Richard clapped, his hands steady, the sound blending into the collective joy. For the first time, he didn't need to be the center of it. After the ceremony, the crowd dispersed, some lingering to tour the site, others snapping photos for social media. Richard stayed back, watching workers hammer beams into place, their rhythm a steady pulse of progress. He felt a presence beside him and turned to find Elena, Christopher back in her arms, his small face peeking out from a blanket. They stood in silence, the space between them heavy with history, but lighter than it had been a year ago. "You've done something extraordinary here, Elena," Richard said, his voice low, sincere. He nodded toward the rising structure, its skeleton a testament to her resolve. This is what Nexus was always meant to be. Elena looked at the building, then back at him, her gaze steady but unguarded. "We're building it, Richard," she said, her words deliberate, echoing their shared past. "Not me, not you, we." She adjusted Christopher in her arms, his soft coo breaking the quiet. This is his legacy too. The word "we" settled over Richard like a mantle, not of ownership, but of partnership. Not the marriage they'd never had, but something new, forged in accountability and purpose. He nodded, words failing him for once, his throat tight with a mix of gratitude and humility. He'd spent a year dismantling the man he'd been learning to listen, to build without ego. It wasn't redemption, not fully, but it was a start. Elena turned to leave, then paused, glancing back. "Keep showing up, Richard," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not for me, not for Nexus, but for him." She tilted her head toward Christopher, who yawned, oblivious to the weight of the moment. She walked away, joining the crowd, her silhouette blending into the sea of hope and possibility. Richard stood alone, the construction site humming around him. The city skyline loomed in the distance, no longer his kingdom, but a backdrop to something greater. He thought of the students he'd mentored, the grants he'd secured, the quiet moments of purpose that had replaced his old hunger for glory. He wasn't the dreamer anymore, not in the way he'd been, but he was part of something real, something lasting. For the first time in years, that was enough. As the sun sets on the Nexus Promise Training Center, Richard and Elena's journey reminds us that legacies are built not on ambition alone, but on truth, accountability, and the courage to rebuild. What did their story stir in you? Share your thoughts on X or with those around you. How do second chances and shared dreams resonate in your own life? Thank you for joining us in this tale of redemption and purpose. Until we meet again, keep building, keep dreaming, and keep showing up.